When Victoria Grant, a highly accomplished black consultant, arrives in a small town to help fix its failing infrastructure, she quickly becomes the target of racial bias and systemic corruption. Despite her professionalism, she is humiliated and forcibly removed from a council meeting by Officer Daniels, a local cop with a history of abuse, who sees her as a threat to his authority. As Victoria challenges the town's leadership and exposes deeply ingrained racism, tensions rise, revealing the stark realities of power, prejudice, and injustice in America. Will her determination be enough to force change? Maria Alvarez tightened the laces of her worn sneakers as she glanced at the bus stop sign. It had started to drizzle, the kind of soft, misting rain that felt almost apologetic as it touched her skin. She adjusted the straps of her oversized backpack and shifted her weight from foot to foot, a silent rhythm of impatience. It was early morning, and the streets of Greenridge, a small town with more coffee shops than stoplights, were just beginning to stir. Workers streamed into their routines, clutching takeaway cups and bracing themselves against the gray sky. For Maria, this day felt no different from the countless others spent in this town. Routine, uneventful, unremarkable. Maria was a senior at Greenridge High, a first-generation Mexican-American student who often felt like the invisible girl no one quite remembered. Teachers called her Marissa, or Marie, more often than not, and when she corrected them, their apologies were fleeting, carried away like loose leaves in the wind. Her friends, well-meaning but detached, never asked her about the hours she spent after school, working shifts at Rosa's diner, tutoring freshmen for gas money, or babysitting her younger brother while her mom took on double shifts. She was used to being overlooked, to fading into the background, like the soft hum of fluorescent lights. But today would be different. Maria could feel it, though she wasn't sure why. The bus arrived, its brakes squealing as it stopped in front of her. She boarded, brushing her damp hair away from her face as she slid into an empty seat near the back. She'd promised her mother that she would deliver important papers to the courthouse downtown before heading to school. Something about finalizing documents for her mom's green card application. "Be careful, mija," her mother had said softly that morning, pressing the envelope into Maria's hands. "It's important." Maria held the envelope carefully now, as though it were made of glass. She looked out the window, watching raindrops streak across the glass as the bus rumbled forward. As the courthouse came into view, Maria gathered her things and stepped off the bus, the drizzle now turning into a steady rain. The building loomed ahead, tall, gray, and imposing. Maria felt a flicker of nervousness, but squared her shoulders. She'd drop off the papers and be back at school before second period. The lobby of the courthouse was nearly empty when Maria entered. She approached the clerk's desk, where a middle-aged man in a wrinkled shirt glanced up from his computer. "Hi, I'm here to drop off some papers for the immigration office," Maria said, her voice polite but firm. The clerk didn't respond right away. He stared at Maria, his gaze lingering on her damp hoodie and oversized backpack. Maria shifted uncomfortably. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked finally, his tone clipped. "No, my mom just told me to drop these off. It's all filled out," Maria replied, holding out the envelope. The clerk didn't take it. Instead, his eyes narrowed, and he leaned back in his chair, as though appraising her. "And you're sure this isn't a mistake?" "These are legal documents," he said slowly. Maria blinked, taken aback. "It's not a mistake, I have everything right here." He said nothing, but Maria could feel the shift in the room, the sudden heaviness of it, the quiet judgment in his gaze. Her pulse quickened as he reached for his phone, murmuring something about needing to check. Maria's grip tightened on the envelope as her mind raced. She had done nothing wrong, yet she could feel it. That something was about to happen, something that would change everything, and she wasn't ready. The rain was relentless, a steady patter that turned the city streets into a murky blur. Victoria Grant adjusted the strap of her leather tote as she stepped out of the car. Her driver, an older gentleman named Martin, rushed around the sleek black sedan, his umbrella already open. "Ms. Grant, let me cover you." "It's just a little rain, Martin," Victoria replied, offering him a small, genuine smile as she waved him off. "Besides, if I'm going to be drenched, I'll do it on my own terms." Martin chuckled, but held the umbrella up anyway, as she strode toward the diner's entrance. Victoria Grant had that effect on people. Whether they knew her as Ms. Grant, CEO of Vanguard Strategies, or simply Vic, the woman who insisted her team call her by her first name. She made people want to care for her, even though she needed no one's protection. The bell above the diner door jangled as she stepped inside. Warmth greeted her immediately, along with the smell of coffee and sizzling bacon. The place was cozy, with cracked red leather booths and a checkered floor that had seen better days. It was one of those small-town diners where nothing changed, except the faces behind the counter. Victoria had chosen this diner intentionally, not because it was particularly special, but because it reminded her of home, a childhood spent in similar places, sitting across from her mother as they split a single plate of pancakes. For someone who owned 3 companies and was worth more money than some small nations, Victoria had never lost her attachment to simpler spaces. Wealth had come, but her roots ran deep. "Morning," called a waitress as Victoria approached the counter. She was young, maybe 20, with a tired smile and a name tag that read, "Chloe. Sit wherever you'd like. Coffee?" "Please," Victoria replied, settling herself into a booth near the window. She shrugged off her beige trench coat and smoothed her crisp white blouse, pulling her notebook from her bag. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but outside, the world looked gray, just as it often felt. Victoria opened her notebook, a well-worn leather journal filled with her thoughts, musings, and meeting notes. She scanned today's agenda. Review contract for potential expansion deal. Call with Women's Empowerment Network at 2 p.m. Dinner with Marcus. She smiled softly at the third entry. Dinner with her younger brother was one of her favorite ways to end a day. Marcus was her balance, her reminder that success wasn't the only measure of a life well lived. The waitress returned, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. "Sugar, cream?" "Black is perfect," Victoria replied. "Got it," Chloe said, disappearing before Victoria could ask for a menu. Victoria sipped the coffee slowly, savoring the quiet. It was a rare thing for someone like her. Vanguard Strategies was one of the fastest-growing consulting firms in the country, and her schedule reflected that. Yet here she was, sitting alone in a rundown diner, dressed like someone's meticulous accountant rather than a woman whose name appeared on Forbes's Power Players list year after year. Victoria liked it that way. She had no need for opulence or grandeur. Wealth, she often thought, was most dangerous when it became invisible, when it seeped into your soul and made you forget where you came from. The bell above the door jingled again, drawing Victoria's attention. A group of 3 men entered, their laughter loud enough to break the quiet hum of the diner. They were dressed in worn jeans and heavy boots, the kind of working men whose voices carried more weight than they realized. Victoria paid them no mind at first, turning her attention back to the notebook. But as Chloe returned with a plate of toast and eggs, she caught snippets of conversation drifting from the men's table. "Can't believe they're bringing in outsiders to fix things," one of the men grumbled. His voice was gravelly, full of disdain. Another man laughed. "Consultants? They've got nothing better to do than tell us how to run our own town. Bet they're all clueless city slickers." Victoria's pen hovered above her notebook. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but the words carried an edge that made it impossible to ignore. She felt their gaze sweep over the diner, landing briefly on her, the only black woman in the room. She kept her eyes down and sipped her coffee. "Not sure how many of them actually know what hard work looks like," the third man added. A flicker of annoyance passed through her, but she swallowed it down. She was used to assumptions, it came with the territory. Woman black. Successful. To many, those words didn't fit together naturally. To some, they still didn't belong in the same sentence. Victoria glanced at her watch. 10:15 a.m. She had come to town early for a meeting with the Greenridge mayor about revitalizing the city's floundering infrastructure, a project Vanguard Strategies had volunteered to consult on pro bono. It wasn't about the money. It was about making a tangible difference. Yet, as the men's words lingered, she was reminded that charity could be a thankless business. She glanced up just as Chloe approached the men's table. Their banter softened slightly, though the glances in her direction didn't. Chloe served them quickly, and then returned to Victoria's booth. "You okay over here?" Chloe asked quietly, a hint of sympathy in her voice. Victoria smiled softly. "I'm fine, thank you." Chloe hesitated, shifting on her feet. Don't let them bother you, they're just set in their ways. Victoria's smile didn't waver. I've dealt with worse, trust me. Chloe nodded, but still looked uneasy. I'll bring you the check whenever you're ready. Victoria closed her notebook and tucked it back into her bag. She didn't need the reminder of how some people saw her, not supposed to be here. They seemed to think, not supposed to be this. As she pulled on her coat and reached for her wallet, she heard a chair scrape loudly across the floor. One of the men had stood up and was making his way to the counter, his footsteps heavy. Chloe, he said gruffly, his voice carrying across the diner. You've got someone paying for their meal with Monopoly money over here? Victoria froze mid-motion, her hand still in her bag. Chloe's face turned pale. Excuse me? The man pointed vaguely in Victoria's direction without looking directly at her. Just asking. Fancy coat, fancy attitude, looks like someone trying too hard to belong. Probably left her wallet in the Mercedes. Victoria's jaw tightened. She turned her head slowly, meeting the man's gaze for the first time. His face registered surprise when she looked him square in the eyes, unflinching. Chloe stammered, Sir, please, you don't need to. It's fine, Victoria said, her voice calm but cutting. She slid her credit card onto the counter before the waitress could say another word. I think we're done here. The man blinked, as though realizing he had gone too far. I didn't mean anything by it, he muttered. Victoria held his gaze a moment longer before turning back to Chloe. Thank you for the coffee. Chloe nodded quickly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Victoria didn't need to stay any longer. She had meetings to attend, people to help, and far better ways to spend her energy. But as she turned to leave, she felt the weight of it settle in her chest, a familiar weight she had carried for years. How quickly they forget, she thought. How quickly they decide what your place is. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy over Greenridge. Martin was waiting by the car, umbrella in hand. Though Victoria waved it away again, she slid into the back seat, closed the door, and exhaled slowly. Everything all right, ma'am? Martin asked gently as he pulled into the road. Victoria nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Yes, Martin, just another day. But it wasn't just another day. Somewhere deep down, Victoria knew the encounter had been a small crack in a dam she could no longer ignore. And it was only a matter of time before the water broke through. Martin pulled the car smoothly into the narrow lot behind Greenridge Town Hall. Victoria stepped out, her heels tapping against the cracked pavement as she walked toward the entrance. The building itself was modest. Red brick, with faded white columns that seemed more decorative than functional. A small, almost forgotten town emblem was etched above the double doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and varnish, and the walls were lined with photos of past mayors. Men in suits, smiling solemnly, each nameplate announcing who they were and when they had served. Victoria's gaze lingered on a particularly weathered photograph before she refocused. A receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a salt-and-pepper bob, looked up from her desk as Victoria approached. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Victoria caught it. A flicker of surprise, hesitation, and the instinctive narrowing of her eyes, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing. Can I help you? The woman asked, her tone clipped but polite. Yes, Victoria said, her voice calm and even. I have a meeting with Mayor Caldwell. Victoria Grant. The woman's brows furrowed as she glanced down at her appointment book. The meeting was scheduled for 10:30. You're early? Victoria offered a small, gracious smile. Yes, I like to make sure I'm prepared. The receptionist still seemed unsure. Her eyes darted briefly over Victoria's appearance, her understated but clearly expensive attire, her leather tote, and the confident set of her shoulders. It wasn't hostility exactly, but it was something Victoria had encountered countless times before. The unspoken question of, who does she think she is? Right, the woman murmured, closing her book a little too loudly. You can take a seat. I'll let the mayor know you're here. Victoria nodded, moving to one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that lined the wall. She set her bag on her lap and folded her hands neatly, her composure unwavering, though she could feel the receptionist's lingering gaze. Minutes ticked by. Victoria checked her watch. 10:32. A door at the back of the office opened, and a tall man with a rounded belly and thinning blonde hair stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space Mayor Caldwell wore an ill-fitting suit, his tie slightly crooked, but his smile was wide and practiced. "Ms. Grant," he boomed, extending a hand as he approached. "Sorry to keep you waiting. Busy morning, you know how it is." Victoria rose smoothly, taking his hand in a firm but measured grip. "Not a problem at all, Mayor Caldwell. I appreciate you making the time." The mayor gave her a once-over, subtle but noticeable. Victoria was familiar with the look. It was the same one she had received in boardrooms across the country. The unspoken mix of curiosity and doubt. "You're the expert," his eyes seemed to ask. "You're the one who's going to save us." "Follow me," the mayor said, leading her through the door into a small, cluttered conference room. The table was strewn with papers, and two other men sat waiting. One, a wiry man with glasses and a sour expression, barely glanced at Victoria as she entered. The other, a younger man with dark hair and an expensive watch, sat scrolling on his phone. "This is Dale from Public Works," the mayor said, motioning toward the wiry man. "And that's Todd, our city attorney." Neither man stood, nor did they offer their hands. Victoria was unfazed. She greeted them with a polite nod and moved to the head of the table, positioning herself where she could command the room. "Shall we get started?" she asked, pulling a slim folder from her tote. "Sure thing," the mayor said, settling into his chair. "So, Ms. Grant, I know Vanguard Strategies has worked with some larger cities on infrastructure projects, Newark, Baltimore, Houston, but Greenridge is, well, different, smaller. We've got our own way of doing things here." Victoria kept her smile in place. "Understood, Mayor Caldwell. I spent some time reviewing the town's challenges and the resources at your disposal. I'm confident we can identify cost-effective solutions to address the most immediate issues: roads, drainage, power grid." "Right," Dale interrupted, leaning back in his chair with an audible creak. "And you think you can figure all that out? No offense, but this isn't Houston." Victoria met his gaze steadily. "None taken. And yes, that's exactly why I'm here, to apply proven strategies at a scale that makes sense for Greenridge." Dale muttered something under his breath, and the younger man, Todd, chuckled. Victoria's spine straightened slightly. There it is, she thought. The cracks were showing already. "Look," Mayor Caldwell said, his voice genial but condescending. "We've had plenty of consultants come through here over the years and, well, you're not what I expected." Victoria's smile didn't waver, but the words landed exactly as they were intended. "What were you expecting, Mayor?" He blinked, caught off guard. I just mean you're very hands-on. You came early, you're organized. And that surprises you?" She pressed gently, though her voice held an edge. The room fell awkwardly silent. Todd looked up from his phone, as though sensing the shift. Dale cleared his throat loudly. "It's not about surprises," Dale said gruffly. "It's about results. Look, Ms. Grant, we're a practical town. We don't need fancy presentations or big ideas that'll cost us a fortune. If that's what you're selling, I'm not buying." Victoria leaned forward slightly, holding Dale's gaze. "I don't sell ideas, Mr. Dale. I solve problems. I'm here because Greenridge asked for my help. If you're not interested, I can go, but I assure you, the problems won't." The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves, Ms. Grant. Why don't you tell us what you're proposing?" Victoria exhaled silently, suppressing the flicker of frustration she felt. This again. She had spent years, decades, proving herself in rooms like these, fighting to be heard and taken seriously. She opened her folder and slid a few documents across the table. "These are preliminary assessments based on the data your office provided. I've outlined short-term repairs to improve safety and reduce costs, as well as long-term infrastructure upgrades to prevent the issues from recurring." Dale barely glanced at the papers before shaking his head. "This looks expensive." Victoria's tone was measured. "It's cost-effective. The repairs prioritize your most urgent needs and save money in the long run." "And we're just supposed to take your word for it?" Dale shot back, a hint of derision in his voice. Victoria paused. The comment stung, not because of the words themselves, but because of the familiar implication beneath them. She had heard it before, many times over. "Who are you to tell us?" "I'm not asking you to take my word," she replied, her voice cool and steady. "I'm asking you to look at the facts." Todd looked between Victoria and Dale, his face neutral, but wary. Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat loudly. Okay, let's take a step back here, Ms. Grant. We appreciate your time and effort. Maybe we'll need a few more meetings to hash things out. Victoria knew what this meant. Stalling, delay tactics, a slow attempt to push her out. She could feel the weight of their biases pressing down on her, unspoken but palpable. She's not one of us. She doesn't understand. She doesn't belong here, but she wasn't going anywhere. Take as much time as you need, Mayor, Victoria said, rising smoothly to her feet. I'll leave you with the documents to review. If you decide you're ready to solve these problems, you know where to find me. Her tone was polite, but the message was clear. I don't need you to believe in me for me to know my worth. She collected her bag and nodded at the room. Gentleman Mayor. As she exited the conference room, she felt the burn of their stares at her back. She had held her composure, but the frustration simmered just beneath the surface. Outside, the receptionist looked up with mild surprise as Victoria strode past without stopping. Did they keep you long? She asked. Victoria paused briefly, offering a faint smile. Not long enough. Outside, Martin was waiting by the car. He opened the door as she approached, his expression one of practiced professionalism. How did it go, ma'am? Victoria slid into the seat, her calm mask slipping slightly. About as expected, Martin. But this isn't over. The car pulled away from the curb. The gray sky still heavy above Green Ridge. Victoria leaned back, staring out the window as the small town blurred past. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, and it wouldn't be the last. The afternoon sun struggled to break through the overcast sky as Victoria stepped into the Green Ridge courthouse. She hadn't planned to come here today, but a phone call from an anonymous town official had changed her mind. The voice on the other end had been hushed, but insistent. You should know there's a meeting happening today. City Council, closed doors. They're planning to vote on pulling the infrastructure project entirely. Something isn't right. Victoria didn't hesitate. She knew how this worked. Progress was inconvenient for people who thrived in dysfunction, and leadership often hid cowardice behind closed meetings and paper trails. If the vote happened today without her knowledge, it would be over before it began. The lobby of the courthouse bustled with activity, clerks shuffling papers, attorneys consulting clients, and police officers moving in and out of rooms. Victoria paused briefly at the reception desk. Excuse me, she said, her voice calm but commanding. Could you direct me to the council chamber? The clerk glanced up, a younger woman with tightly coiled braids. She looked flustered, her eyes darting to the officer standing a few feet away. It's closed to the public today, ma'am, sorry. Victoria's gaze hardened slightly. That's curious because the infrastructure project involves taxpayer funds. The public has a right to transparency, don't you agree? Before the clerk could respond, a voice broke in. Something wrong here? Victoria turned to see a police officer approaching. His badge read, Officer Daniels, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, and radiating an authority that was meant to intimidate. His gaze flicked over her, first her tailored navy blazer, then her face, where he lingered a moment too long. I'm looking for the council chamber, Victoria said, her voice steady. I'm Victoria Grant, here to represent Vanguard Strategies. There's a meeting happening about the infrastructure project, and I need to be present. Officer Daniels raised an eyebrow. Closed meeting, no outsiders allowed, you'll have to leave. Victoria pulled her shoulders back. With respect, officer, I'm not an outsider. Vanguard is consulting on this project. I have a right to be there. The officer stepped closer, his posture shifting subtly, a hint of challenge in the way he loomed. Ma'am, I said it's closed. Now I don't want to have to ask again. Victoria could feel the shift in the air, how the clerk looked away, how the noise of the courthouse seemed to dull around them. It was a familiar dance, one she had navigated countless times before. Don't react. Don't let him win. Perhaps you don't understand. Oh, I understand plenty. Daniels cut her off, his voice sharper now. You're here causing trouble when you've been told to leave. Maybe you're in the wrong place. Victoria inhaled deeply, choosing her words carefully. I'm exactly where I need to be now. If you'd kindly direct me to someone in charge, we can resolve this. Daniels's face hardened. You don't seem to get it, lady. I don't care who you are. If you keep pushing, I'll remove you myself. The threat hung in the air, tangible and heavy. Around them, people had stopped pretending not to notice. Victoria felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained calm. I suggest you reconsider. Officer removing me from a public building without cause will not reflect well on you or this town. Is that a threat? Daniel said, his voice low and edged with menace. Victoria's hands curled into fists at her sides, though she kept them hidden. It's a fact. For a moment, the two of them stood locked in a silent standoff. Then Daniels grabbed his radio and muttered something into it. 2 more officers appeared at the far end of the hallway, and Victoria's stomach tightened. All right, I've had enough of this, Daniels said, stepping closer. You're coming with me, let's go. Excuse me? Victoria's voice sharpened, though she still held her ground. Obstructing official proceedings, disturbing the peace. Take your pick. Victoria knew what was happening. Knew this was not about rules or protocol. This was about control. She could feel the eyes of the courthouse staff on her, could hear the whispers beginning to spread. Officer Daniels, she said carefully, her voice like steel. You're making a mistake. But he didn't care. He reached for her arm, gentler than necessary but still wrong, so utterly wrong, and Victoria felt the humiliation, the anger, rise in her throat like bile. Don't touch me, she said sharply, pulling her arm free. It happened quickly. Daniels grabbed her again, rougher this time, and Victoria instinctively stepped back, bumping into the corner of the reception desk. The sound was enough to draw more attention. Gasps rippled through the lobby. Ma'am, I'm warning you, Daniels said, his voice booming now. Come quietly, or I'll have no choice. The world narrowed to that moment, the way his hand squeezed her wrist, the murmur of the watching crowd, and the cold shock of indignity spreading through her chest. This again here, of all places. And then, Officer, let her go. The voice was quiet but firm. Victoria turned her head to see a man in his late 30s standing just behind Daniels. He wore an unassuming suit, a brown leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder. His face was familiar, though she couldn't place it. Mitchell, Daniels growled, stay out of this. Mitchell ignored him, stepping closer. Victoria Grant, right Vanguard Strategies? Victoria nodded, surprised. Mitchell turned back to Daniels. You don't want to do this. She's here for the infrastructure project, the one you'll be paying for when the streets flood again next spring. Daniels scowled, his grip loosening slightly. You're overstepping, Mitchell. No. Mitchell replied calmly. You are. She's not breaking any laws, and this isn't how we handle things. For a moment, Victoria thought Daniels might dig in further, but the crowd was growing, clerks peering around corners, attorneys stopping mid-stride to stare. The attention was too much, and Daniels knew it. He let go of her wrist abruptly. Fine. She's your problem now. Daniels shot Victoria one last venomous look, before turning on his heel and stalking away, muttering into his radio. As he disappeared down the hall, the other officers lingered for a moment before following suit, the tension in the room beginning to dissipate. Victoria exhaled slowly, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Mitchell stepped forward, his expression apologetic. I'm sorry about that, he said quietly. This town has its issues. Victoria straightened her shoulders, brushing invisible dust from her blazer. That's putting it mildly. Mitchell gave a small, rueful smile. I'm Carter Mitchell, Assistant City Attorney. I recognized you from the project files. Thank you for stepping in, Victoria replied, her voice still steady. I appreciate it. Don't mention it, he said, then glanced toward the council chamber doors at the end of the hall. You're here for the meeting? Yes, Victoria said firmly. I intend to be heard. Mitchell nodded, his face unreadable. It's happening right now. Come with me. I'll get you in. Victoria followed him, her composure returning with every step. The shame and frustration still burned beneath the surface, but it was eclipsed now by something sharper. Resolve. She would not let this moment define her. As they approached the chamber, Mitchell paused and turned to her. I'll be honest. They don't want you here. But the town needs this. And they need you, whether they realize it or not. Victoria's gaze was steady. Then let's make them realize it. Mitchell pushed the heavy wooden doors open, and all heads in the room turned toward them. The council members, Mayor Caldwell included, sat at a long table, their expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance. "Ms. Grant," Mayor Caldwell said slowly, as if her presence were a personal affront, "this is a closed meeting." "Then you'll have to open it," Victoria said, stepping into the room. Her voice was clear, commanding, and louder than she intended. "Because I'm not leaving until we have this conversation." Silence filled the chamber. The stakes had shifted, and Victoria Grant was ready for the fight. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that filled cracks like cement and suffocated everything in its path. The council chamber, a modest room with wooden desks and peeling flags on the walls, was packed tighter than Victoria expected. In addition to the council members, a handful of staff and community representatives sat scattered throughout the gallery, whispering among themselves. The air smelled faintly of damp carpet and coffee that had sat too long. Victoria stood at the threshold, her sharp heels the only sound as they clicked against the tiled floor. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. Good. Let them stare. Mayor Caldwell cleared his throat and gestured to a seat at the far end of the room. "Ms. Grant," he said, feigning politeness, "you're here without notice. This meeting is closed." Victoria finished for him, her voice crisp, but not unkind. "Yes, I heard. But this meeting concerns the infrastructure project my company has been consulting on. If the council plans to discuss pulling the project, I have every right to be here." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring someone to push back. The wiry man from earlier, Dale from Public Works, leaned forward in his chair, sneering just slightly. "Ms. Grant, we appreciate Vanguard's input," he said, voice laced with condescension. "But this is a local matter, we can handle it ourselves." Victoria turned to face him fully, the sharpness in her gaze enough to make Dale's smirk falter. "That's exactly the point, isn't it?" she said coolly. "It's been handled for years, and yet you still have collapsed roads and flooded neighborhoods every spring." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Dale opened his mouth to respond, but Victoria wasn't done. "Let's call this what it is," she continued, walking to the center of the room. "This meeting isn't about my qualifications or Vanguard's solutions. It's about resistance to change. You don't want me here because I'm holding a mirror up to your failure." The mayor shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's enough, Ms. Grant." Victoria froze mid-step and turned toward him. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but her face was a mask of composure. "Why?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Because I'm telling the truth?" For a moment, no one spoke. Caldwell's face was flushed, and his jaw clenched tightly, but it was Dale who broke the silence. "Look," he snapped, his voice louder than necessary. "You can call this whatever you want, but the fact is, you don't belong here. You don't know this town or its people. You're just another outsider coming in with your fancy numbers and city arrogance, thinking you can fix something you don't understand." Victoria's temper flared, but she reined it in with practiced ease. She'd heard variations of this speech 100 times before, words cloaked in civic pride but dripping with defensiveness. "Mr. Dale," she replied calmly, "what I understand is that families here have been asking for help for years, and nothing changes. You don't have to like me or my methods, but the numbers don't lie. You can dismiss me as an outsider all you want, but at some point, you'll have to decide if pride is worth more than progress." The murmurs grew louder now. Some of the council members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, exchanging glances that were equal parts frustration and uncertainty. "Mayor," one of the younger council members said hesitantly, "I don't see the harm in hearing her out." Caldwell glared at him, before turning his attention back to Victoria. "Fine," he said, the word forced through clenched teeth. "You have 5 minutes, Miss Grant." Victoria's lips curved into a slight victorious smile. "Thank you." She turned, opened her bag, and pulled out a neatly bound report. In the brief moment it took her to set the papers down, the council members and gallery watched her with a mix of begrudging respect and residual doubt. She felt the undercurrent of hostility, but she also saw cracks in the facade. Before she could speak, the doors to the chamber burst open. "Mayor Caldwell!" The sudden shout spun every head in the room. Officer Daniels strode into the chamber, his boots echoing against the floor. Victoria's stomach dropped as his gaze fixed on her. Not now. Mayor, we have a problem, Daniels announced, walking straight up to the table. This woman, he jabbed a finger in Victoria's direction, caused a disturbance in the courthouse lobby earlier today. She refused to leave when ordered and became combative with officers. Lies. Victoria's heart pounded as the gallery erupted into gasps and whispers. Caldwell's face lit up with something she could only describe as relief, as though Daniels had handed him the perfect excuse to eject her. Is this true? Caldwell demanded, looking at her. No, Victoria said firmly, stepping forward. That's not what happened, Daniels sneered. She's lying. I'm not, Victoria shot back, her composure cracking for the first time. You grabbed me, officer. You escalated the situation. I did nothing wrong. That's enough, Caldwell barked, slamming a hand on the table. He turned to Daniels. Remove her from the premises. On what grounds? Victoria demanded, her voice rising. I have a right to be here. Not anymore, you don't, Daniels interrupted, already moving toward her. Victoria's instincts screamed at her to stand her ground, but she knew the risk of resisting, knew how quickly they could turn this moment against her. Daniels grabbed her arm, rougher than before, and the room fell into shocked silence as he pulled her toward the doors. Let go of me, Victoria said, her voice shaking with restrained fury. This is outrageous! Officer, wait! Victoria turned sharply to see Mitchell, Carter Mitchell, standing from his seat in the gallery, his face flushed with anger. You can't do this, he said, his voice loud and clear. This isn't right. Sit down, Mitchell, Daniels barked, yanking Victoria another step toward the door. Mitchell didn't sit. Instead, he turned to the mayor. Mayor Caldwell, you know this is wrong. She's done nothing to justify this. You're using Officer Daniels to silence her because you don't want to answer her questions. The room erupted again, louder this time. Some of the gallery members stood, murmuring in confusion and outrage. Caldwell's face turned an angry shade of red, and Victoria saw the panic flicker in his eyes. Enough! Caldwell roared. She's disrupting official business and creating a safety concern. Take her out! Victoria's chest burned with anger and humiliation as Daniels dragged her through the doors and into the hall. She heard voices behind her, Mitchell arguing, others shouting, and then the door slammed shut, cutting off the noise. Unbelievable, Daniels muttered, tightening his grip as they made their way toward the courthouse exit. This is an abuse of power, Victoria snapped, her voice deadly calm. You have no grounds to remove me, and you know it. Daniels said nothing, but his jaw tightened. As they stepped outside into the chilly afternoon air, a small crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps. Curious onlookers, courthouse employees, and a few reporters with cameras. Victoria froze for a moment, realizing what was about to happen. Daniels didn't stop. He pulled her down the steps, past the gawking crowd, as flashes erupted and voices called out, Mrs. Grant! What happened? Is it true you were causing a disturbance? Officer, what's going on? Victoria's entire body felt hot, her face flushed with humiliation. Every instinct screamed at her to yell, to fight back, but she knew that wouldn't work. Not here, not now. Instead, she looked directly at the cameras as she was led past them, her voice low but clear enough to carry. I'll be back, she said, her words deliberate. And when I come back, you're going to hear the truth. The reporters shouted more questions, but Daniels shoved open the door of his patrol car and motioned for her to get in. Victoria paused for a fraction of a second, scanning the crowd, before stepping into the car and sitting tall, her hands folded neatly in her lap. As the door slammed shut behind her, Victoria's mind was already racing, the humiliation fading to something sharper. Resolve. This was far from over. Victoria sat stiffly in the back of the patrol car, her mind whirring like a machine with gears wound too tight. Outside, the town square of Greenridge loomed through the fogged-up windows, its courthouse steps still dotted with lingering onlookers. Cameras flashed in the distance as the reporters clung to their story. And Victoria knew exactly what narrative was forming. Disruptive woman, removed from council meeting. Let them write their headlines, she thought. This isn't over. Officer Daniels sat in the front, the driver's seat barely containing his hulking frame. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his smirk cutting through the quiet like a blade. Big city types always think they're smarter than everyone else, he said, the satisfaction dripping from his voice. Maybe next time, you'll know your place. Victoria's calm mask cracked just slightly as she met his gaze through the mirror. I know exactly where my place is, Officer Daniels, she said icily. And it's not back here. Daniels snorted and shook his head. You've got a mouth on you, don't you? Victoria didn't respond. She didn't need to. Let him gloat for now. Her strategy was still forming, but one thing was clear. She couldn't let this stand. The car pulled to a stop behind the small, weathered police station, tucked between a bakery and an empty hardware store. Daniels yanked open her door, his smug grin widening. Out! Victoria stepped out of the car with the same poise she'd carry walking into a boardroom. Her heels clicked against the pavement, and she straightened her blazer. Daniels led her through a side entrance where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the air smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic. A few officers behind the front desk looked up, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. Daniels grabbed her elbow, unnecessarily forceful, and led her to a small, windowless holding room. Sit down, he ordered, pointing at a plastic chair bolted to the floor. Victoria didn't move. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her voice razor-sharp. What exactly am I being detained for, Officer Daniels? Obstructing the peace? Disturbing your ego? His smug smile faltered. You want to keep talking, or do you want me to make this official? Victoria held his gaze, refusing to blink. I have every right to demand justification for this. She crossed her arms. I'd also like my phone call. Daniels sneered. You'll get it when I say you do. That was the moment it clicked for Victoria. The arrogance. The unchecked power. Daniels wasn't just a cop on a power trip. He was a symptom of something far deeper. A culture that let men like him thrive because no one dared question them. She took a steady breath, forcing her voice into an even tone. You're afraid. Daniels frowned, confusion flickering across his face. What? You're afraid, Victoria repeated, her gaze steady and unflinching. You think that if someone like me stands up to you, if I demand answers or refuse to shrink, you lose control. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. It terrifies you, doesn't it, that the power you cling to isn't as absolute as you pretend it is? Daniels's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Victoria shot back. You dragged me out of that courthouse because I challenged you. You didn't like that a black woman dared to stand in your way. I see it in your face. His hand twitched, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his confidence. Keep talking, Miss Grant, he growled. You're only making this worse for yourself. Oh no, officer, Victoria said, her voice dangerously calm. You're the one making this worse. You're the one on camera dragging me out of a public meeting. You're the one who escalated a situation because you didn't like the way I stood up to you. Daniels hesitated, his facade cracking. There's no cameras in here, no witnesses. Victoria arched a brow, her confidence unshaken. There doesn't need to be. People saw what happened outside, reporters saw it, your mayor saw it. How long do you think you'll be able to spin this your way? Daniels stared at her, breathing hard, his face flushed. For the first time, she saw the doubt creeping into his expression. His arrogance was still there, but it had been punctured. The door behind them burst open, and a voice rang out. What the hell is going on here? Victoria turned sharply to see Carter Mitchell striding into the room, a manila folder clutched tightly in his hand. His face was red with anger, but it wasn't directed at her. He turned his glare on Daniels. Daniels, what are you doing? Mitchell snapped. You're out of line. This doesn't concern you, Mitchell, Daniels replied, though his voice had lost its edge. The hell it doesn't, Mitchell shot back. I just came from the mayor's office. You overstepped your authority. He waved the folder in Daniels' face. She was invited to that meeting, and you had no right to remove her. Daniels faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to respond. You're making a mess of this town, Daniels, Mitchell continued, his voice rising. You think you can pull this crap forever? It's over. I have witnesses, statements, and reporters already on this story. If you don't release Ms. Grant right now, you'll be lucky if you're still wearing that badge by morning. Victoria watched as Daniels's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. He shot her a glare. One last attempt to assert his dominance, but she didn't flinch. The power had shifted. She could feel it. "Fine," Daniels spat, his voice low and bitter. "Take her, but don't think this changes anything." "Oh, it changes everything," Victoria said quietly, her voice steady and firm. Mitchell stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let's get you out of here." Victoria nodded, her chin high, and turned toward the door. As she walked out of the holding room, she couldn't resist one last look back at Daniels. He was still standing there, his fists clenched at his sides, seething. Outside, the sunlight was breaking through the clouds, casting sharp rays across the courthouse steps. A small crowd had gathered again. Reporters, curious townsfolk, even some city staff. Mitchell led Victoria to the top of the steps, where the buzz of voices grew louder. "What happened, Miss Grant?" one reporter called out. "Were you arrested?" another asked. Victoria turned to face them, the humiliation she'd felt earlier replaced by a surge of purpose. "What happened today is an example of exactly what's wrong with this system," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't just about me, this is about abuse of power, about intimidation, and about a refusal to listen to the people this town is supposed to serve." The crowd grew quiet, hanging on her every word. Victoria took a step forward. "But let me be clear," she continued, her tone resolute. "I will not be silenced. I will not be intimidated, and I will not let this town's future be decided by fear and corruption." Reporters scribbled furiously as cameras snapped. Mitchell stood just behind her, his expression one of quiet respect. The crowd murmured in agreement, the tide of opinion visibly shifting. For the first time since arriving in Greenridge, Victoria felt the weight begin to lift. The road ahead would still be long, and the fight far from over, but this moment belonged to her. As the questions continued to fly, Victoria raised a hand for silence. "This isn't the end of the story," she said, locking eyes with the crowd. "It's just the beginning." And with that, she turned and walked down the courthouse steps, her heels clicking sharply against the stone as the sun broke fully through the clouds above. Victoria Grant stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows behind her. The crowd was still gathered, their murmurs a constant hum. Questions, curiosity, doubt. The press, quick to sense a headline, clustered near the base of the steps, cameras trained on her every move. But Victoria wasn't focused on them. Her gaze was locked on Officer Daniels, who had planted himself like a sentry near the courthouse doors, arms crossed and a scowl carved into his face. Behind him, Mayor Caldwell and Dale hovered, their faces tight with tension, as if hoping the scene might dissolve into nothing if they waited long enough. Victoria took a step down, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. The sound cut through the noise, pulling attention her way. Daniels didn't move, but his jaw tightened, his disdain clear. The man thrived on intimidation, but today, right now, he was losing. "Officer Daniels," Victoria said, her voice carrying over the square, "you owe me an explanation." Daniels sneered, though his stance wavered slightly. "I don't owe you anything, lady." "Wrong," she shot back. "You owe this town an explanation. You owe everyone here a reason why you're abusing your badge to silence someone who dares to speak up." The crowd shifted uneasily. Daniels glanced at the onlookers, clearly aware of how exposed he was. "You disrupted a public meeting," he barked, his voice rising. "I was doing my job." "No, you weren't," Victoria countered, descending another step, her gaze never leaving his. "You escalated. You chose to humiliate me. And why? Because you couldn't handle a black woman standing her ground." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few gasps broke through the noise, though Victoria didn't pause. She was moving with the precision of someone who'd spent years dismantling men like Daniels, piece by piece. Daniels's face flushed crimson. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" Victoria's voice was ice cold now. "You'll arrest me again, drag me out in front of the cameras. Go ahead, show everyone here who you really are." Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, Carter Mitchell's voice rang out. "You don't need to answer that, Daniels, I will." The crowd turned as Mitchell pushed through the people at the base of the steps, clutching a thick folder of documents. His expression was sharp and determined, the indecisive man Victoria had met earlier, now replaced by someone ready for battle. "What are you doing, Mitchell?" Daniels snapped, the edge of panic creeping into his voice. "Something you should have done a long time ago," Mitchell said, coming to stand beside Victoria. He turned to face the crowd, the folder raised in his hand. "Everyone, listen up. What happened today, what Officer Daniels did, wasn't an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern." Daniels' eyes widened and his posture shifted defensively. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Mitchell shot back, his voice growing louder. "This folder contains complaints against Officer Daniels, documented incidents of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. Every single one buried, ignored, or quietly dismissed, and every single one targeted the same kind of person." Victoria's chest tightened as the implication hung in the air. The crowd stilled, tension thrumming like an electric current. "What the hell are you doing, Mitchell?" Daniel's voice cracked, his anger now mixed with something else, fear. "This is slander." "Then sue me," Mitchell replied flatly. "But first, explain this." He opened the folder and held up a document, turning it so the crowd could see. "This is a formal complaint filed last year by a local business owner, Maria Torres. She was accused of loitering outside her own store. Officer Daniels detained her without cause." More gasps. Daniels' fists clenched, his glare bouncing between Victoria and Mitchell. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You're twisting things." "I'm not twisting anything," Mitchell retorted, holding up another document. "Here's a report from 6 months ago. A teenage boy named Jamal Bryant, detained for acting suspiciously while walking home. No evidence, no charges, just a frightened kid and an officer abusing his authority." The whispers turned into open outrage. Daniel's mask of control was crumbling, sweat beading on his forehead as he stared Mitchell down. "These are lies." Victoria stepped forward, her voice cutting through the rising noise. "They're not lies, Daniels. They're the truth you've been trying to bury, just like you tried to bury me this morning." Her words echoed across the square, and Daniel's face twisted with fury. "You don't know anything about this town," he snarled, his voice low but dangerous. "You come here with your fancy reports and your big city attitude, thinking you can tell us how to run things. You don't belong here." Victoria froze. The words weren't new. They'd been hurled at her in one form or another throughout her life. But hearing them now, from Daniels, in front of this crowd, something shifted. "This isn't about me not belonging," she said softly, her voice carrying enough weight to silence the murmurs. "This is about people like you, deciding who does belong. You look at people like Maria Torres, like Jamal Bryant, like me, and decide we're threats because of the color of our skin, because we don't fit into your small, narrow view of the world." Daniels opened his mouth to reply, but Victoria wasn't finished. "I came here to help this town. I came here to fix problems that you and your leaders ignored for years, but you couldn't see me for what I am, a professional, a leader, a human being, because you never wanted to." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound rolling through the square like thunder. Daniels's face paled as he turned toward Caldwell and Dale, looking for support. But neither man met his gaze. Caldwell looked away, his expression tight with discomfort, while Dale sank lower in his chair, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing. Mitchell stepped forward again, addressing the crowd. "This stops today. I'm filing these complaints with the State Attorney General's office. Officer Daniels will be investigated, and I promise you, every single voice that's been silenced will be heard." Daniels took a step back, his confidence shattered. "You're making a mistake," he growled, though the threat in his voice had lost its edge. "No," Victoria said, stepping beside Mitchell. "The only mistake is thinking people like you can't be held accountable." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, their anger and frustration finally boiling over. Reporters shoved microphones toward Victoria, shouting questions she couldn't hear over the noise. Mitchell turned to her, his expression a mix of relief and respect. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Victoria exhaled slowly, the adrenaline coursing through her veins finally settling. "I'm fine," she said. "But this isn't over." Mitchell nodded. "No, it's not. But you made them listen." Victoria looked back toward the courthouse steps, where Daniel stood alone now, his shoulders slumped and his face hollow. Caldwell and Dale had disappeared into the crowd, leaving him behind like an anchor dragging them down. For a moment, Victoria felt a flicker of pity for the man, but it passed quickly, replaced by a deeper, sharper resolve. Daniels wasn't the root of the problem. He was just one branch in a tree that had been growing unchecked for too long. As the crowd continued to surge, Victoria turned away, heading toward the waiting reporters. She wasn't done yet. There were more questions to answer, more voices to lift, more work to do. But for the first time since arriving in Greenridge, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. This town might not be ready for her, but she was ready for it. And she wasn't going anywhere. 3 days after the courthouse confrontation, the town of Greenridge felt different. The morning sun was unseasonably warm for early fall, casting a golden glow over the streets that had once felt gray and heavy. Victoria Grant stood near the window of her hotel room, coffee in hand, watching the movement below. The town square was buzzing. A small crowd had gathered, reporters mingling among local residents. The headlines had spread quickly: Greenridge officer accused of systemic abuse. Consultant challenges corruption in small-town leadership. Voices of the silenced speak out. Victoria's phone buzzed on the desk behind her. She picked it up, glancing at the caller ID. Carter Mitchell. "Good morning," she answered, her voice even. "Morning, Victoria." Mitchell's tone was warmer than it had been days earlier. "Thought you'd want to know. Officer Daniels has been officially placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. State officials will arrive tomorrow to review the complaints." Victoria exhaled slowly, the weight of the news settling in her chest. "And Caldwell?" "The mayor is scrambling," Mitchell replied, with a small, sardonic laugh. "After the press got hold of everything, the council's calling for a special meeting. There's talk of him stepping down, maybe even a recall. Dale is already distancing himself. Typical." "Typical," Victoria echoed. She wasn't surprised. Men like Caldwell and Dale always retreated when the consequences started closing in. But Daniels was different. He had been exposed for what he was, not just a symptom of the system, but someone who had thrived within its cracks, unchallenged. "Are you going to come down to the square?" Mitchell asked. "They're gathering at the community center soon. Residents, press, a few local leaders. A couple of folks you might want to meet." Victoria glanced back at the town square, where people were still arriving. They looked determined, hopeful, different. "I'll be there," she said. "Give me 20 minutes." The community center was a small, aging building with faded banners and rows of folding chairs. When Victoria arrived, she was greeted with curious stares and a few hushed whispers. Word had spread quickly, and while not everyone knew her name, they knew what she had done, or at least what they thought she had done. Carter Mitchell was waiting near the front, standing with a small group of residents. When he spotted Victoria, he offered her a smile and gestured her over. "Victoria," he said warmly. "Glad you came." "Of course," she replied, scanning the room. It was packed, residents of all ages and backgrounds, many of whom looked uncertain, but hopeful. Mitchell began introducing her. "This is Maria Torres, the business owner I mentioned, and this is Jamal Bryant's mother, Ms. Bryant." Victoria shook their hands one by one, listening as they each thanked her quietly. Maria, a small woman with determined eyes, squeezed her hand tightly. "They ignored us for years," Maria said, her voice low but fierce. "But you made them listen. Thank you." Victoria felt a lump form in her throat. "You shouldn't have had to wait for someone like me to come along, but I promise you, this isn't the end, it's a beginning." Ms. Bryant nodded tearfully. "For my boy, and for everyone else, thank you for not backing down." Victoria smiled softly and squeezed her hand. As she moved through the crowd, more people approached her, some hesitant, some emboldened. A man in a flannel shirt murmured, "We never thought someone would call them out like that." A teenager with a camera shyly asked for a picture, mumbling something about his family watching her on the news. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was progress. The meeting began, led by a local community organizer named Angela Ruiz. Angela, a woman in her late 50s with graying curls and the no-nonsense attitude of someone who'd spent her life in grassroots advocacy, stood at the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," Angela said, her voice carrying across the room. "We're here because, for too long, This town has allowed people like Officer Daniels and leaders like Mayor Caldwell to go unchecked. That changes now." The room erupted in applause, and Angela motioned for quiet. "We have work to do. Daniel's suspension is a step, but it's not enough. We're calling for a full review of the police department. Every officer, every incident. We're demanding accountability from city leadership, and we're going to make sure they listen." The crowd murmured in agreement, the energy in the room buzzing. Angela turned to Victoria. "Ms. Grant," Angela said, her tone softer now, "I think I speak for everyone when I say, thank you. You reminded this town that silence doesn't fix anything. If you have anything to say, we'd love to hear it." Victoria hesitated. Public speaking had never intimidated her, but this moment felt heavier. She rose from her seat and moved to the front of the room, the crowd watching her intently. She took a breath, centering herself. "I didn't come here to fight," she began. "I came here to help, but sometimes, helping means challenging people who don't want to be challenged, and sometimes, it means refusing to be quiet when someone tells you to sit down." The room was silent, hanging on her words. "What happened to me isn't unique," she continued. "It happens in towns and cities across this country every day. People who abuse their power rely on silence, they rely on fear, they rely on the belief that no one will hold them accountable, but they're wrong." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "I won't lie to you," Victoria said. "This isn't over. Daniels may lose his badge, Caldwell may step down, but those are symptoms, not the disease. Real change will take time, and it will take work. You'll have to keep showing up, keep speaking out, keep pushing, even when it feels like no one is listening." She paused, letting her words settle. "But if you do that, if you refuse to back down, you can change everything." The room erupted into applause. Victoria stepped back, Angela taking her place again. As the meeting continued, outlining concrete steps and plans for future action, Victoria felt something shift inside her. She had come to Greenridge as an outsider, a consultant trying to fix a broken infrastructure system. But now, she saw the truth. The real cracks weren't in the roads or the drainage. They were in the system itself, in the people who held power and abused it. She wouldn't fix it all in a day, or even a year. But the first step had been taken. Later that evening, Victoria stood outside the community center, watching as people spilled out into the cooling night air. Maria Torres waved to her from across the parking lot, smiling as she walked toward her car. A group of teenagers stood nearby, still buzzing with energy, already making plans to get involved. "Leaving tomorrow?" Mitchell's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Victoria turned to him, smiling faintly. "Yes, I've got work to do back home, but I'll be back." Mitchell nodded, his expression softening. "You made a difference here, Victoria. They won't forget it." "Neither will I," she replied. He smiled and extended a hand. "Safe travels, and thank you for everything." Victoria shook his hand, then turned to head to her car. As she opened the door, she glanced back one last time. The town square was quiet now, the lights from the courthouse glowing softly in the dark. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done. But for the first time, Greenridge felt alive, as if its people had woken up and realized their voices mattered. Victoria slid into the car, her mind already racing with thoughts about what came next. More projects, more fights, more systems to dismantle. She smiled to herself, the resolve in her chest stronger than ever. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Victoria Grant sat on the balcony of her high-rise office in the city, the skyline stretching endlessly before her. The hum of distant traffic merged with the quiet rustle of the wind, a symphony that usually grounded her. Today, though, her mind lingered elsewhere. Back in Greenridge, a place she hadn't planned to remember so vividly. It had been a week since she'd left the small town, and yet, it still clung to her. Its people, its voices, its flaws, etched into her memory. Her trip had started as a professional assignment, consulting on infrastructure for a town struggling to stay afloat, but it had become something much larger, a battle she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Carter Mitchell. She picked it up with a smile, already sensing the news he had to share. "They're doing it," he said without preamble. The council voted to fire Daniels and start a full audit of the police department. Caldwell resigned this morning. Victoria let out a slow breath, the knot in her chest easing just slightly. Good, she said softly. It's a start. It's more than a start, Mitchell replied. You should see the town right now. People are organizing. They're talking about real change, community meetings, accountability boards. I think you woke something up here, Victoria. She smiled faintly, though the weight of everything remained. They woke themselves up, Carter. I just gave them a push. He paused on the other end, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice when he said, Thank you. For everything. I don't think we'd be here without you. After ending the call, Victoria leaned back in her chair, watching the sunlight bounce off the glass buildings in the distance. The victory in Greenridge felt meaningful, but she knew it wasn't the end of the story. Not for her. Not for the people still fighting battles in towns just like it across the country. Reflections on the journey. Greenridge had reminded Victoria of the truth she'd always known, but sometimes tried to forget. Change was slow. It was messy, frustrating, and often met with resistance from those who had the most to lose. But it was also possible, and that was what mattered most. The events that had unfolded, Officer Daniels' abuse of power, the silence of the town's leadership, the whispers of residents who'd been mistreated and ignored for years, were not unique to Greenridge. They were symptoms of something deeper, woven into the fabric of institutions across the country. Racism, power imbalances, systems built to protect those already at the top, often at the expense of those at the margins. Victoria had fought these battles before, but this one had been different. It hadn't been fought in a corporate boardroom or on a national stage. It had happened in a town where her name had carried no weight until she forced people to see her for who she was. Someone who refused to back down, who refused to be silenced. Her experience in Greenridge had tested her resolve and stripped her back to the core of who she was. She thought of the moment Daniels had grabbed her arm, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than anything she'd felt in years. She had been angry, yes, but what had stayed with her most was the reminder of how quickly her humanity could be denied. How easily a person, no matter how accomplished, could be reduced to nothing in the eyes of someone desperate to hold on to their illusion of power. It wasn't fair. It wasn't new. But it could change. Victoria thought of the people she'd met in Greenridge. Maria Torres, standing tall despite years of being ignored. Jamal Bryant's mother, who had fought tirelessly to protect her son from a system that saw him as a threat. And the teenagers, who had looked at her like she was someone who had given them permission to dream a little bigger, fight a little harder. They were the heart of the story. They were the ones who would carry the fight forward. For too long, people like Daniels and Caldwell had relied on silence, on the assumption that no one would push back or stand up to them. But silence, Victoria knew, was its own kind of violence. It allowed injustice to root itself deeper and deeper until it became invisible, so ingrained in the system that people stopped questioning it. But the people of Greenridge were questioning it now. They were organizing and demanding answers, accountability, and progress. Maria had formed a small coalition of local business owners to advocate for fair treatment. Angela Ruiz, the community leader, was working with Mitchell to establish a civilian oversight board for the police department. Victoria knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight. Daniels might lose his badge, Caldwell might step down, but the systems they represented, the biases, the inequalities, wouldn't vanish with them. It would take persistence, vigilance, and the kind of resilience she'd seen in people like Maria. It would take people willing to stand up and say, enough. Moving forward. Victoria sipped her coffee and turned her attention to the notebook lying open on her desk, its pages filled with plans for the future. Greenridge had been one town, one battle, but it was far from the last. Her work, her real work, was just beginning. She thought back to what she had told the crowd outside the courthouse. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning. The words had resonated not just with them, but with her too. For years, Victoria had focused on fixing systems, roads, drainage, bridges, tangible things that could be measured and mended. But Greenridge had reminded her that the most broken systems were the ones no one could see, the ones people were too afraid to confront. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from a civil rights organization asking her to speak at their upcoming event. Another buzz. A voicemail from an activist group in another small town, one fighting a battle eerily similar to Greenridge's. Victoria smiled faintly as she looked at her phone. Her name had carried weight before, but now, it carried something more. It was a reminder. A symbol of what could happen when someone refused to be silent. She wasn't naive. She knew the fights ahead would be just as hard, if not harder. She knew there would be more Officer Daniels, more Mayor Caldwells, more towns where people clung to their illusions of control. But she also knew that voices, when loud enough, determined enough, could topple even the most stubborn walls. A call to action. Victoria's story was not unique. Greenridge was not unique. Across the country, people were fighting their own versions of this battle. Ordinary people standing up to injustice, to corruption, to systems that tried to diminish them. Her message, to herself and to anyone willing to listen, was simple. Speak up. Refuse to be silent. Refuse to be small. Silence was what kept people like Daniels in power. Fear was what allowed systems to remain broken. But voices, bold, defiant, and unrelenting, could shake the very foundations of those systems. Victoria stood and stepped back onto the balcony, feeling the breeze on her face. The city stretched before her, vast and sprawling, its streets teeming with lives she would never know. But she didn't have to know them to fight for them. Greenridge had been a turning point, a reminder that change didn't happen all at once, but one voice, one story, one step at a time. She leaned against the railing, the afternoon sun warm on her face. Somewhere, she imagined, Maria was rallying her coalition. Angela was organizing a meeting. Mitchell was working late, pushing forward investigations that would make a difference. Change was happening, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably, and Victoria would be there for it. She smiled softly to herself, her resolve stronger than ever. It was only the beginning.